Hello there, my name is Matt Golding, and this is the first in a series of Zoom interviews for the South Bay Entrepreneurial Center. The South Bay Entrepreneurial Center provides mentorship and education for local entrepreneurs, and we are excited to try this new format in this COVID-19 arena. There'll be lots of different interviews with lots of different local experts, and we're very excited about today's first guest. First of all, my name again is Matt Golding, and my business is Storyline Strategy. I provide marketing strategy for small to mid-size and growing companies that need help understanding what their story is, what their positioning is, creating a great marketing plan so they can deliver the tactics and grow their business. Our first guest of this great entrepreneurial Zoom interview series is Mark Hiraide, and he is a unique and very special friend of the South Bay Entrepreneurial Center. His partner Lee Petalon was the founder of the SBEC, one of the initial founders, and after Lee passed, Mark joined the board of directors where he's a specialist mentor. Mark is a corporate and securities partner at Mitchell Silberberg Knupp. He is a former branch chief of the Securities and Exchange Commission in LA and Washington, D.C. Mark has a passion for representing entrepreneurs and participated in drafting the crowdfunding provisions of the Jumpstart Our Business Act, the Jobs Act, passed by Congress in 2012, and testified before the Securities Subcommittee of the Senate Banking Committee during hearings on the bill. He has a very special interest in the South Bay Entrepreneurial Center and in a great knowledge base on equity crowdfunding. So, Mark, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew, for that nice introduction.
Did I miss anything?
No, I think you hit all the highlights. Thank you.
Yeah. So we're going to keep it casual. This is crazy times. First of all, I hope all is well with you and your circle.
Thank you. Yeah, staying inside, and it looks like we'll be inside for a few more weeks. But other than cabin fever, managing to get by. Fantastic.
So I think that it's timely that you're the first guest on this series. We're going to be talking about crowdfunding, which is your sweet spot, because it's something a little bit different that might be a new and different creative form of funding for companies that are struggling, especially during the environment right now. But we probably need to take a step back and really get a sense of what crowdfunding is. Can you just give a 30-second overview so that...
Yeah, in a nutshell, crowdfunding is raising money from the public. There are a couple types of crowdfunding. We're going to be talking about equity crowdfunding. And now that's to be distinguished from donation-based crowdfunding that you would see, for example, on Kickstarter or GoFundMe, where the public are making donations in exchange for a production credit in a movie, a T-shirt, a coffee mug. Okay. We're talking about equity crowdfunding, where the company is raising equity capital.
And that's significantly different than those other types of funding. So I know you'll get into that there are different types of equity crowdfunding too. So actually, let's go there. There are different types of crowdfunding in the equity side. Is one different than another?
No, when we talk about equity, we're talking about securities or investments. I mean, most commonly you would think of common stock or preferred stock, convertible notes, but virtually any investment contract is within the definition of security for federal and state securities laws. So virtually any investment can be sold as long as you comply with these equity crowdfunding rules.
Got it. And I know that you've been involved with the California legislature in trying to change some rules. Can you briefly explain how that's affecting entrepreneurs, and especially during this time?
Sure. So I've drafted a bill that's pending before the California state legislature to amend some of the California securities laws to make a little easier raising capital in California. We're going to be talking today about the federal crowdfunding regulation, CF regulation crowdfunding, and my bill would reduce some of those requirements to make it a little easier.
What types of companies or entrepreneurs do use equity crowdfunding?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's important to note that equity crowdfunding has only been legal since 2016, pursuant to the legislation that Matthew mentioned, the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act of 2012, although the SEC didn't promulgate the rules for crowdfunding until 2016. So it's relatively new, and it's not that well known as a vehicle for raising funds, hence part of the reason we're having the program today. Most commonly, people think about it in connection with traditional high-tech, high-growth companies that might are startups that maybe want to become unicorns, that hope to be an IPO candidate or an acquisition candidate. But really, it can be used, and we're going to talk about this today, it can be used as a financing vehicle for any business, particularly small businesses, even those that are not suitable equity candidates.
So are we talking a restaurant or a mom and pop dry cleaner? What are the limitations of who can tap it and use that as a creative source?
Yes.
And who can't?
Okay. So when I talk about small businesses that are not traditional equity candidates, I'm speaking exactly of those kinds of small businesses. It is available to virtually any small business. With traditional equity, the investors typically are expecting to exit through a liquidity event of the company, like an IPO or a sale. But for mom and pop businesses, especially those that are profitable, mom and pop don't intend to sell any portion of their business. And so therefore there would be no exit for an equity investor, but they certainly have the ability, the mom and pop, to generate cash flow, revenue, income. And it's the ability to share in that revenue or income that is considered to be an investment contract that will allow these kinds of businesses to raise capital using equity crowdfunding.
Some of the people who might be watching this have probably watched Shark Tank and Kevin O'Leary, and oftentimes he does not invest in an equity stake, he does a revenue share. Is that what we're talking about?
Precisely. Yeah, very good example. So particularly for consumer companies where the investor, for example, may offer to make an investment in the company and receive a share of the revenue or profit from a particular product or product line. That's a perfect example of a revenue share. The company is not giving up any equity, not selling a piece of the ownership of the company to the investor, but instead they're giving a share of some profit or revenue.
What is a typical ask, or does it range?
Yes.
In dollar amount, depending on the company. Right.
So first of all, equity crowdfunding allows the company to go directly to the investor, basically disintermediating, to use an overly used word, Wall Street, from the process of capital raising. That's good from the standpoint that historically companies have not been able to access capital in that way. Wall Street wasn't interested in underwriting a small mom and pop restaurant, but by the same token, without an intermediary, a professional intermediary, the company has to, through its own devices, get the word out about its company and its offering and the investment opportunity. So to answer your question about how much is typically raised, you can raise under regulation crowdfunding up to $1,070,000, but most campaigns that I see, the successful ones are raising several $100,000. Some of them raise up to $1 million, but typically they're raising between anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000, $600,000.
And in this new COVID-19 arena, some of those thresholds have come down. Correct?
Yes. So we're going to talk about the new SEC rule that just was promulgated last week that will make it extremely easy to raise up to $250,000 using equity crowdfunding.
Okay. I know we'll talk about that later. It sounds like there is a lot of some thresholds and some hurdles that one needs to get over. Do you need a lawyer, an accountant, a marketing person? What's critical in order to make this type of creative financing work and be the right choice?
Right. Okay. All right. Let me take the accountant first. So the accountant, some of the rule that we mentioned, and we're going to talk about them in more detail in a second, will allow you to raise capital without getting an accountant's review. Now, a review is a very formal engagement by an accountant. It's not he takes a look and thumbs through your financial statements. It's a very formal attest. They call it attest engagement. It's not, doesn't rise to the level of an audit, but it's a fairly comprehensive review that the accountant, it has to be a certified public accountant, will conduct, and then the accountant will issue a review opinion. That if you are required to get a review, and we'll talk about when you're required to do that, then you will need to get an outside CPA. You're not required to hire a lawyer, although, obviously, I'm going to explain how you should use a lawyer to be cost effective. Part of what I'm going to show you today is how to prepare your offering so that if you do engage a lawyer, you can minimize the amount of time that the lawyer has to spend with you. And I'm going to explain to you how best to do that.
Okay. That's probably the best segue to get into your presentation. I know you've got 5 basic requirements. So let's see if technology will work here and hear your overview of those 5 key pieces.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go through the basic who, what, when, where, how, why. Who, it's not just for unicorns, as we said. You do have to be a company or entity that's organized in the United States. So Canadian companies, foreign companies are not eligible to use this. You cannot be a SEC public company. You cannot be an investment company, which is a fund. And you cannot have been sanctioned by the SEC or state securities regulators, because after Dodd-Frank, there are disqualification provisions for bad boys. Okay, what is it that you can sell? Again, not just stock. It's not just common and preferred stock or convertible notes, which are very typical forms of financing for startup companies, new companies. Those are equities. In order for the investor in those kinds of instruments to realize a return, typically there has to be an exit of the business, a sale of the business, so that the investor can sell his stock into, for example, a liquid market if the company were to go public, or sell his stock along with the founders, other owners, to a merger and acquisition candidate. But what we're talking about today are small businesses or companies that are on that road to perhaps an IPO or perhaps an acquisition, but that are in the transition. They've kind of burned through friends and family money. They're not eligible for bank financing because they don't have hard assets for the bank to lend against. And so they're kind of in this middle area. They may, for example, have developed the product. They may have a major customer that's ready to purchase, enter into a purchase order, and they've identified the supply chain. Now they just need the capital to get the product, generate that first minimum viable product.
So they almost can be used as a bridge type of financing? Is that fair? Or?
Yes, certainly. It can be used as a bridge financing. Virtually any investment is going to be deemed to be a security. And so any investment can be sold through this regulation crowdfunding, including, as we were discussing, revenue or profit share agreements, which make the most sense for smaller businesses that aren't going to have an exit like an IPO or aren't going to be acquired.
And just before you change the next slide, my sense is, from our earlier conversations offline, it can be as creative as the entrepreneur wants in terms of what those agreements are, correct?
That's right. That's right. If it's going to be a profit sharing agreement, as opposed to a common equity or preferred equity, it's going to be an investment contract. And the investment contract can contain any terms that you can dream up and convince the investor that it's worth investing in. This is where you probably need the help of a financial person to be able to articulate and maybe structure the best investment that will work for both the investor and for the company. The more complicated the terms are, it may be more difficult to find an investor to invest. And as we're going to talk about, you have to provide full disclosure. And so you have to be sure to describe the terms very clearly.
Great. Understood. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Where? Okay. A very important requirement of equity crowdfunding is you must conduct the offering through what's known as a crowdfunding portal. These portals are required to register with the SEC as a crowdfunding portal. You may have heard of some of them. I've listed here kind of the probably 5 largest, probably best well-known crowdfunding portals. There are actually, I think, about 50 that are registered with FINRA. You could Google Equity Crowdfunding and FINRA, or Equity Crowdfunding Portal, and FINRA, which is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority that licenses brokers. You will see a link to their list of all of the approved portals, but these are the most prominent.
And are some stronger in some different segments than others? Is that?
Yes. Yes. So you will see that what the portals offer, in addition to having staff who can guide you through the process, they have tools that will allow you to create your landing page or campaign page. I kind of call it like the Wix of funding. And some of them are very robust. I mean, you just load up your photos and your videos and answer some questions on a questionnaire and hit a button, and poof, you've got a landing page for your campaign. You've got an offering document. But as we're going to talk about, you want to, in making the disclosures, you want to be sure that you do your homework there, and we'll talk about that. Okay. Another distinguishing feature among the portals, although they charge relatively the same amounts, are the fees. Typically, all the portals will charge a back-end percentage of the raise, a percentage of the amount that you raise. And then most of them will charge an upfront fee, somewhere in the $5,000 to $10,000 range, which they call marketing fees. Some of them will provide kind of marketing advice for you. And most of them will defer the payment of those fees until you raise your first money. And so really, it's a way to raise capital with very little upfront cost. The only cost is in the preparation, which we're going to talk about next. And as I mentioned, the SEC COVID rule, which is available only until August 31st, has made it very inexpensive, cost-effective to launch a campaign to raise up to $250,000. Okay, so next, let's talk about how you actually go about conducting one of these offerings and the documents you need to prepare. There are going to be 2 basic documents. There are your financial statements and something called an offering statement, or for those of you who are familiar with the capital raising process, it's a disclosure document commonly called a private placement memorandum, PPM, in the case of a privately offered security. It's called a prospectus in the case of a company that's doing an IPO. And for regulation crowdfunding, it's called an offering statement. It looks a lot like a private placement memorandum. The offering statement, let me start with that. The offering statement is required to contain the risk factors of the risk of investing in the business plan, importantly, the use of proceeds, how the money will be used. And my suggestion is, and I'm going to try to take you through this very quickly, my suggestion is to prepare your documents beforehand. You review a number of offering statements on the SEC's website, as well as risk factors that are contained in more comprehensive IPO prospectuses. Okay, so let me see if I can take you there now. So if you can see my browser, I would start Googling NYSE IPO or IPO, and you'll find the NYSE site, IPOs at the NYSE. I like this site. There are a number of different sites that list IPOs, but I like this site because it will show you a listing of IPOs, and it will show them to you by industry. And what you need to do is you need to identify a company that's in your industry that has recently gone public or is conducting a public offering. Okay, once you identify a couple of companies, and you don't need to go to the IPO list, you can just Google, or you may be familiar with a company that is in your industry that's similar to you. You go to, just Google SEC, and go to the SEC website, sec.gov, or even better, if you click on company filings, it will take you to this page, company filings page. It's also accessible on the home page of the SEC, where you input the company name. Okay, so let's say, for example, let's take give me a company, give me a public company, an IPO, Matthew.
Oh wow.
Let's say
Shake Shack.
Which one?
Shake Shack, or a hamburger joint, or Starbucks.
Well, let me. The reason that I'm suggesting finding one that has done a recent IPO is because what we want to look at is the prospectus. So, well, let's do Zoom. Okay, so if we go to Zoom, and it's going to list all of the companies that are named Zoom.
Oh, wow.
But when you click on one of them, it's going to provide this list of all the SEC filings. Now, it may be a little difficult for you to know what an 8K is, for example, but there's a description of all SEC forms on the SEC website, and 8K is a current report. All right, so in this case, okay, what we want to look for is the IPO prospectus, and that is a Form S1. So you see here, a Form S1/A is an amendment to the S1. It doesn't matter whether it's the original S1 or the amendment. You want to take a look at the Form S1. Okay, and what you'll see is a prospectus. I thought this is not Zoom, the
different Zoom
video conferencing company, but it's another company. Because Zoom, the video conferencing company, has a glossy prospectus. But nevertheless,
okay.
Yeah, this will contain the information that you're trying to obtain. Namely, you want to get an idea of what the risk factors are
for that industry,
company in this industry. Right.
So if I'm a dry cleaner or a restaurant, I try to find a larger company that is trying to go public, and then I drill down to see what those risks are. Is that?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Now,
so it seems cumbersome, but it really isn't that challenging.
Yeah, that's right. The other thing you want to do is actually look at sample Reg CF offering statements, and you can go to latest filings, and there's a box that says form type. If you type Form C, which is the SEC form for regulation crowdfunding offering statements, and retrieve filings, these are all recent Form C. C-A is an offering statement. So here you see amended offering statement. And if you go to the Form C, I'm sorry, this is the Form C, the actual form itself that the portal will help you complete. But one of the documents that I said is the actual offering statement. This is a sample of an offering statement for this company. And it's the answers to the SEC's form questions for a disclosure document. But what you will see is it contains much of the same type of information in a much abbreviated form as you will find in a IPO prospectus. So it will have a description of the business, the offering, risk factors, the use of proceeds, description of the officers and managers. That is what lawyers do. They look at filings like this. And if you hire a lawyer and say, look, I just need to do an offering, please help me, they're going to spend a lot of time doing that, which you can do. They're going to spend a lot of time drafting, and that's where it gets expensive. So if you can
do it on your own
in advance, do it yourself, so to speak, and then have a lawyer review it, it is much more cost effective. Okay,
and
so
I'm sorry, Mark, again, drawing it down to a local business, how does one know what filings have been out there for a local mom and pop shop or restaurant, dry cleaner, whatever the small manufacturing? How does one know what's being done on a bigger picture? Is that just being created in a Google search?
I don't think the SEC Edgar database has the functionality, although it may, to find Form Cs, which are Regulation CF offering statements, right, by industry. Probably the best way to do that is to scour those few portals and look on those portals to look for offerings that are similar.
And then work backwards.
Got it. And you may not be able to download the Form C unless you register on that portal as an investor, but you can go to the SEC's website once you have the company name and punch in the company name and in that search tool, which is right on the homepage of the SEC. And that company, if they filed a Reg CF offering, and if you see them on a portal and they're already advertising, they're required to file that with the SEC. It will be there. It will be publicly available, and you can pull it up just like we did.
Great.
Okay. So the offering statement, the disclosure document, is one of the two documents that you need. The other are the financial statements. Now, if you've been in business for more than 2 years, you only need to include the 2 most recent fiscal years' financial statements. And the existing rule is that if you raise up to $100,000 only, you only need to self-certify those financials, just certify that the financials are true and accurate. If you raise over 100 and you're using Reg CF for the first time, you can raise up to $1,070,000, but you need to get an accountant's review. What the SEC temporary COVID rule did was it waived that rule to require a review if you only raise up to $250,000. So basically, it increased the $100,000 limit for self-certified financials to $250,000. So it did some other things too. For example, under the existing rules, you have to have the offering open for 21 days before you can take funds. They've cut that way back in this temporary rule, and it will allow you to take funds almost immediately. But the big requirement, the big waiver of the COVID rule is this waiver of the requirement to get the accountant's review. Reviews may cost between $5,000 and could be $30,000 or more, depending on the complexity of the historical operations of the company. So, the whole idea behind this SEC rule is to allow companies to launch quickly and to raise funds quickly, as long as they comply with all the other rules of Regulation CF.
Great.
All right. There is a requirement once you conduct an offering to file every year an annual report. You are required to include financials in there, but they only need to be self-certified, so you don't have to hire the accountant every year. But you obviously, just as you've seen, the information becomes public. And so it is a public document. It's available to the public, anyone who searches the SEC website. All right, some other rules for crowdfunding. There are, as I said, you can only raise up to $1,070,000. Last month, the SEC proposed to increase this to 5 million. I believe the SEC will adopt that rule. And so I think that crowdfunding is going to be much more prominent as a mechanism to raise capital. I recently heard Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank, who is very bullish on crowdfunding. In fact, he's taken a position with one of the portals, an equity position. And he recently was saying that he thinks in 5 years, while VC financing will still exist, that much more financing of that type will be done through equity crowdfunding.
Interesting.
There are investment limits. The investors, if they make either less than 100,000 or they have net worth of less than 100,000, then they may only invest up to the greater of $2,200 in any 12-month period, or 5% of their income or net worth. Frankly, most, and the companies can set the offering price at whatever price they wish. So most offerings, I think, are offering securities or revenue shares for hundreds of dollars. So it may be 250 to 500,000. And the investor may invest as much as they want, as long as they meet these requirements regarding their investment limits. If they make over 100,000 and they have 100,000 or more of net worth, then they can invest up to a maximum of 107,000 in any 12-month period. Okay, that's it. Those are the basic rules.
Very helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much. In this COVID-19 environment, I guess in particular, crowdfunding in general, what are the biggest landmines, issues, concerns that someone needs to be aware of so they don't step in some doo-doo?
Well, as I mentioned, one of the biggest issues is that your company becomes very public, and the disclosures that you're required to make in the offering statement and the risk factors. Basically, I tell clients, look, if there's something that you don't want people to know about your business, almost by definition, you're required to disclose it, because the securities laws require that you disclose all, quote, material information. And the Supreme Court has defined materiality as information that would be important to a reasonable investor in making their investment decision, essentially. And so it's a full disclosure regime. You have to make full disclosure. And there are, significant consequences if you don't meet these requirements. Namely, you can be held personally liable to return all of the investors' money if you don't follow the rules.
Got it. Lots of information, very helpful. Thank you. If someone has any additional questions, what's the best way to ask you to get information about equity crowdfunding?
I'm happy to talk to anybody, especially the SBEC folks. Give me a call. My number.
We'll have your contact information online.
Okay.
So I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I guess I was taking notes as you were talking, and I have my three biggest takeaways, and correct me if I'm misunderstood or if I missed any big ahas, but I think the first one is that equity crowdfunding is a new and growing alternative way to raise cash, and especially during this COVID-19 arena, the rules have changed. August 31st is a big date because you have up till then to have that ask of up to $250,000. Is that pretty accurate in that first big aha?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Second, that angels, VC, debt raising, they're still out there, but there is this new source that should be thought of. It's a creative way, and it's a new way to really engage with your customers or your vendors or partners to raise cash that people might not have thought of before.
That's right.
And third, there still are a lot of compliance and issues that you need to be aware of. It's not as cumbersome as it used to be. You do need to do some research, but it's a heck of a lot easier than it was. And I guess that's
right.
It.
Yeah, that's right. Before the Jobs Act, the law relating to regulation of securities offerings was the same since Congress started regulating in 1933, and you virtually couldn't do an offering except to accredited investors, high net worth individuals. The whole concept of equity crowdfunding, this disintermediation of Wall Street, is completely new. Mm-hmm. And as we said today, I think it's going to become a much more viable way for companies to get capitalized.
Fantastic. Changing gears, 180-degree turn, a question I'm going to be asking you and everyone else who is part of this series. If you were to have one book that you would recommend that has been inspirational to you for an aspiring entrepreneur or a small business owner, something that should be read and should be kept on someone's bookshelf, anything come to top of mind?
Well, so I have a book I published for Thomson Reuters, one of the early equity crowdfunding guides, but I wouldn't recommend it. It really was written for lawyers to explain to them what it's about. But I would recommend Venture Hacks.
That's a shameless plug. That
yeah, don't get that book.
But if you did, what's the name of that?
Venture Hacks. I would recommend Venture Hacks. It's a very useful guide to raising
Venture Hacks. Okay, we will
financing.
Put a link to that at some point in the future. And your book that you wrote, or books, is there a series of titles?
Well, again, they're really designed for lawyers. It's crowdfunding. I think something analysis of the SEC rules, and Thompson, and then Lee and I are the authors. Now I'm the principal author of the treatise representing startup companies. But again, that's a treatise designed for lawyers.
Okay. So there's no movie coming out on that?
No,
movie rights.
Not the most exciting topic.
But this has been very helpful. Thank you. Very informative. Appreciate your time today. This is actually going to be a two-part series. At some point in the very near future, we're going to actually have someone, a little mini panel discussion with Mark again, with someone who actually has gone through equity crowdfunding and some creative financing. So stay tuned for that in the future. Thank you, Mark. Have a great day. Be safe.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you also for all your support of the SBEC. You're doing a great job. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.